My family threw me away at 15 because my brother was the genius. But 15 years later, I arrived at my grandmother's birthday party and confronted them all when they saw what I became. I'm 31 years old. I work in corporate finance for a pretty large company. I live in a house I bought myself across the country from where I grew up. And I need to tell this story because what happened when I was 15 basically destroyed my relationship with my parents forever, though they didn't know it until recently. The truth is, I've been carrying this around for like 15 years, and only now, after a brutal confrontation at my grandmother's birthday party, do I think I can finally get this off my chest. I don't know if I'm looking for validation or if I just need someone to understand why I don't talk to my parents anymore, even though technically they didn't do anything illegal. They just sent me to live with my uncle when we were poor and decided to keep my younger brother instead of me. I guess I should start at the beginning, when things were still normal. My family was pretty typical. I mean, my dad, David, had an import-export business that was doing well. My mom, Emily, worked as a nurse at the local hospital. I played basketball at school, and my younger brother, Samuel, 3 years younger than me, was that type of kid who got straight A's without trying too hard. We lived in a decent house. We weren't rich, but we didn't lack anything either, stable middle class. I was like 14 years old, and things between Samuel and me were good, like we were normal brothers who fought over stupid stuff but generally got along well. My dad worked a lot, but when he was home, he'd watch my basketball games. My mom cooked for us, and everything was, I don't know, functional, I guess. Everything changed when I was 15, and my dad lost his business. Turns out his business partner, a guy he'd trusted for years, basically scammed him and took a bunch of money from the company. My dad didn't see the betrayal coming until it was too late, and by the time he realized what had happened, they were already bankrupt. We lost everything. I mean, everything. They had to sell the house, the car, liquidate their savings to pay debts, and we moved to a much smaller house that my mom was able to get with help from my grandmother, Dorothy. My dad fell into a severe depression after that, stopped looking for work for months, spent his time in bed or watching TV, doing nothing. And basically it was my mom who had to support the family on her nurse's salary, which wasn't much. What happened next is the part that still hurts when I think about it. My dad started comparing us, Samuel and me, all the time. Like Samuel would get an A in math and my dad would say, "Look, Alexander, why can't you be more like your brother? He actually has a future." I'd get B's or high C's, which wasn't bad really, but my dad acted like I was a complete failure. And the worst part is my mom never stopped him, never defended me, just stayed quiet or nodded her head like saying, "Yeah, your brother is better than you." Every dinner was a comparison session where Samuel was the genius and I was the mediocre, one who wasn't good for anything. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. But at that moment, I just thought my dad was depressed, and that eventually, he'd go back to being like before. The situation got worse when they banned me from playing basketball. I was on the school team. I was good. Not a star, but I was a starter and I loved it. It was literally the only thing that made me happy during that shitty time we were living through. But my dad decided basketball was a waste of time, that I needed to focus on improving my grades so I could get a university scholarship because there was no money to pay for my college. I told him basketball could get me an athletic scholarship, but he just laughed and said I wasn't good enough for that, to stop dreaming and start studying like Samuel. They pulled me from the team, banned me from any extracurricular activities, and basically locked me in the house to study, while Samuel continued being the perfect child who could do whatever he wanted because he got straight A's. Things came to a critical point, like 6 months later, when my grandmother Dorothy came to visit us. She lived in another city but came every so often to see how we were doing, and I think she realized how bad the situation was. One night I heard my grandmother talking to my parents in the kitchen. E was in the hallway, couldn't sleep, and she suggested that maybe it would be a good idea for one of us, Samuel or me, to go live with my Uncle William and Aunt Rebecca. They didn't have kids, lived like 3 hours away, had a big house and good jobs, and my grandmother thought they could help alleviate my parents' financial burden. At that moment I thought, well, if this happens, they're obviously going to send Samuel because he's the favorite. But turns out no. Turns out my parents decided the opposite. A week after that conversation, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. Samuel wasn't there. They'd sent him to a friend's house. And my dad told me, Alexander, we've made a decision. You're going to go live with your Uncle William and Aunt Rebecca for a while. I froze, literally couldn't process what I was hearing, and I asked for how long, and he just said, "We don't know, until things get better here." I asked why me and not Samuel, and my dad looked at me like it was obvious and said, "Your brother has exceptional academic potential. He needs to be here where we can support his education. You'll be better off with your uncle where there's less pressure." My mom was just sitting there wiping away tears, but not saying anything, not defending me, not saying, "Wait, this isn't right." In that moment, I realized they'd already decided everything, that there was nothing I could say to change their minds, that basically they were choosing me to discard because Samuel was more valuable to them. 2 weeks later, I was in my Uncle William's car on the way to his house. With all my stuff in 2 suitcases, the trip was weird, uncomfortable. My uncle tried to make conversation, asking me about school and my interests, but I just gave short answers because I was devastated. I wasn't crying or anything. I think I was still in shock, but inside I felt like my family had abandoned me, like I wasn't good enough to stay. When we got to my uncle's house and my Aunt Rebecca greeted me with a hug and showed me my room, which was bigger than the room I shared with Samuel in the small house, I just thought, this is wrong. I shouldn't be here. I should be home with my family, but there was no going back. The first few months with my Uncle William and Aunt Rebecca were strange, but honestly, much better than I expected. They were completely different from my parents at that time. Like my uncle was laid back, made jokes, never compared me to anyone, or told me I was a failure. My aunt cooked amazing meals and always asked how I felt, how school was going, if I needed anything. At first I was closed off. Didn't trust that this was real. Thought eventually they'd also get tired of me and send me back, but it never happened. My uncle asked me what I missed from my previous life, and I told him basketball, and literally a week later he signed me up for a local team and bought me new shoes to play. Nobody had asked me what I wanted in months, and suddenly, these people who technically had no obligation to me were doing more for me than my own parents. My life started to improve. My grades went up because I finally had a stable environment to study, where nobody was yelling at me or comparing me to my brother all the time. I went back to playing basketball and I was happy again. I regained the confidence in myself that I'd lost during that horrible year with my parents. My uncle and aunt went to all my games, encouraged me, celebrated my achievements no matter how small they were. I talked to my parents like once every 2 weeks on the phone, short conversations where my dad asked how school was going and I said, fine, and basically nothing more. They never asked if I missed home or if I wanted to come back, and I never told them how well I was doing because part of me wanted them to feel bad about what they'd done. The years passed, and I kept living with my uncle and aunt. I graduated high school with honors, which was amazing considering my parents thought I was mediocre, and got a full scholarship to study finance at my dream university in another state. My parents came to my high school graduation, brought Samuel, who was already in high school, and we organized a small party at my uncle and aunt's house. I remember that day perfectly because that's when I realized my parents were never going to see my success as something valid. My dad spent the whole party talking about Samuel, about how he was taking advanced classes, about how he was going to study medicine, about his bright future. Every time someone congratulated me on my scholarship, my dad would say something like, "Yeah, Alexander did well, but wait until you see what Samuel is going to achieve." My mom didn't say much either, just smiled and nodded when my dad talked about Samuel. At my own graduation party, I was a secondary character in my brother's story, and that hurt more than I can explain. I went off to university and focused completely on my studies. I worked part-time to have extra money, did internships every summer, built my network of contacts, basically did everything I could to ensure that when I graduated, I'd have an excellent job. I talked to my parents maybe once a month, superficial conversations that meant nothing. I talked more often with Samuel. He and I had maintained a decent relationship. He knew what my parents had done was wrong, but never said it out loud because he didn't want to cause problems. 4 years later, I graduated with honors from university, got a job at a financial consulting firm with a starting salary that was more than my dad had earned in his best years, and I moved across the country to start my career. My career took off quickly. I was good at what I did, worked hard, got promoted every 2 years or so, and by the time I was 28, I was already a senior manager at my company with a six-figure salary. I bought my own house, nothing fancy but mine, had a good car, traveled when I wanted, basically had the stable and successful life my parents never thought I could have. Meanwhile, Samuel had studied medicine like my parents wanted, but he was struggling. Had lost his job at a clinic due to performance issues and was fighting to establish himself. I sent him money every so often to help him, even invested in a small business he wanted to start, not because my parents asked me to, but because Samuel was my brother, and I wasn't going to punish him for the decisions my parents had made. Everything exploded like 6 months ago at my grandmother Dorothy's 75th birthday party. The whole family was going to be there. It was the first time in years. We'd all be together in the same place, and I decided to go because I wanted to see my grandmother and, honestly, because I wanted my parents to see what I'd become. I arrived at the event in my car, a good sedan, not ostentatious but definitely better than what my parents had. And my parents' reaction when they saw me was total shock. My dad literally stood there with his mouth open. My mom said, "Alexander, you look so different, so adult." You know, as if they hadn't seen me in years, when actually I'd gone to visit them like 2 years ago for Christmas, and I already looked professional then. During the party, several people, uncles, cousins, my grandmother's friends, asked me about my life, and I told them about my job, my house, my travels, and I could see my dad listening to every conversation with an expression I couldn't decipher. At one point, my Uncle William was telling a group of people about how proud he was of me, about how I'd overcome everything and become a successful man, and my dad came over and said, "It's incredible how things turned out. I never thought Alexander would get this far." And there's something inside me broke. Like all the resentment from 15 years came out at once, and I said, "Yeah, Dad, it's incredible what someone can achieve when they don't have their father constantly telling them they're a failure." The group went silent. My uncle looked at me like, "Uh-oh, this is going to get ugly." And my dad said, "What are you talking about, Alexander? We always supported you." I laughed, literally laughed in his face, and said, "You supported me? You sent me to live with Uncle William because you decided Samuel was more valuable than me. You told me I had no future. You banned me from doing what I loved. You made me feel like garbage for a whole year before getting rid of me. And everything I've achieved, this career, this life, is despite you, not thanks to you." My dad turned red. Everyone was staring now, and he said, "We were going through a financial crisis. We had to make difficult decisions. We couldn't support 2 children. And I told him, "But you could support Samuel, the genius, the one with potential, the one worth keeping. You discarded me like I didn't matter." My mom came over crying, saying, "Alexander, please don't do this here." But I couldn't stop anymore, and I told her, "Why not, Mom? Why can't I tell the truth? You spent years making me feel inferior, and now that it turns out the son you discarded is more successful than the one you kept, suddenly you want to act like you always believed in me?" My dad tried to say something, but I interrupted him and said, "You know what's the saddest thing? That Uncle William and Aunt Rebecca, who had no obligation to me, gave me more love and support in 1 month than you did in 15 years. They helped me become this." Pointed at myself. "You only told me I would never be enough." And I left the party, got in my car, and drove back to the hotel where I was staying, trembling with rage and adrenaline. That night, my mom called me like 10 times, left voicemails crying, saying we needed to talk, that I was exaggerating, that they'd done the best they could in an impossible situation. I didn't answer. The next day, my dad sent me a text message saying I owed him an apology, that I had embarrassed the family in public, that I had no right to talk to them like that after everything they'd sacrificed. That made me laugh because, seriously, I owed them an apology? I decided to write them a long, detailed email, explaining every moment of pain, every comparison, every time they made me feel I wasn't enough, every phone call where they asked about my grades but never about how I felt, every visit where they talked about Samuel but never about my achievements. I told them I'd spent years in therapy, which is true, working on the self-esteem issues they'd caused me, that I'd had to rebuild my sense of self-worth from scratch because they'd destroyed it. and that if they wanted a relationship with me now, they needed to acknowledge the damage they'd done and apologize for real, not just say, sorry, we had to make difficult decisions. My mom called me crying 2 days later saying I was right, that they regretted how they'd handled things, that they never meant to make me feel that way. But when I asked her if she thought it had been okay to send me away while keeping Samuel, she got defensive and said Samuel needed more academic support, that it wasn't about loving one more than the other. I told her that was exactly the problem, that they'd prioritized Samuel's academic potential over my emotional well-being, that they'd made me feel disposable. She went quiet and then said, I don't know what you want me to say, Alexander. We can't change the past. And I told her, no, you can't, but you could have acknowledged it before, you could have apologized before, you could have tried to repair the relationship before it got to this point. Now it's too late. The damage is done, and I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you. It's been 6 months since that party, and I basically don't talk to my parents. I send them a text message on their birthdays, at Christmas, protocol things, but nothing more. I still have a good relationship with Samuel. He understands why I'm angry and doesn't judge me for distancing myself from our parents. My uncle, William, and Aunt Rebecca continue to be the most important people in my life. I consider them more my real parents than my biological parents. And last week, I bought them tickets for their dream trip to Europe as a thank you for everything they did for me, for basically saving me. My aunt cried when I gave them to her, hugged me, and said, I didn't have to do that, but I wanted to. I needed them to know that their love and support meant everything to me. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive my parents for sending me away, for choosing Samuel over me, for years of making me feel inferior. Part of me understands they were in a difficult situation, that maybe they did the best they could with the resources they had, but another part of me can't forget the pain, the feeling of abandonment, the sensation that I wasn't good enough to stay. What I do know is that I proved they were wrong about me, that the son they discarded for not having enough potential ended up being more successful than they ever imagined, and that I achieved it, not thanks to them but despite them, and thanks to 2 incredible people who gave me a chance when my own parents didn't. I guess that's my victory, though it still feels bittersweet.